This is Popular Force, a podcast focusing on the very niche and kind of geeky details of near future war and unreported conflict with me, Josh Hanky Hank. Today, we're going to be talking with Scott Forrest, who is a sort of independent researcher focused on conflicts in the Mediterranean. On today's discussion, we'll be going on with the ongoing civil war in the Republic of Altus and Stratus, which has been ongoing in recent years despite a ceasefire in 2030, which was supposed to end the fighting. Did I get that right?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh. And, in fact, despite the ceasefire being signed in 2030, known as the Jerusalem ceasefire due to the location of the signing, the fighting never really stopped entirely. The FIA essentially signed the agreement because really their only options to continue the fight in a conventional sense had run out, due to their international support for their cause waning and foreign powers, namely NATO and CSAT, putting their backing behind the governments headed by Georgios Akanteros.
Oh, right, but before we get into that, can you sort of go over the backstory of the start of the conflict in Altus for those who aren't aware? With all the crazy shit going on in the world, I think a lot of what went on there wasn't widely reported at the time.
Of course, yeah, I may have gotten a bit ahead of myself. So in 2026, a faction within the Altian military, headed by Colonel Akanteros, initiated a coup d'etat, deposing the internationally recognized civilian government and taking power. The country had been going through very rough economic times, as is most of the world right now, of course. Despite this, a large portion of the population didn't accept that a military takeover was the right way to go. So during a massive demonstration in the capital, government troops opened fire on them with live ammunition.
Oh yeah, I remember seeing footage at the time. It was bloody awful, mate. I think dozens of people were killed, right?
That's right. Of course, things only escalated from there. Many citizens took up arms against the Altus armed forces. Not only that, they were actually joined by many deserters from the military who didn't like where things were headed. The civil war went on for about 4 years, with the Jerusalem ceasefire officially putting an end to it. But even after the loyalist faction disarmed and the country was supposed to fall in under Akanteros' rule, a group calling themselves the Freedom and Independence Army announced that they would continue to fight against the government.
Or, if I recall correctly, wasn't there a group with that same name during the ever-on Flashpoint back in the 80s?
I believe so, but as far as I can tell, the groups are unrelated except for the name. So the FIA are kind of a politically agnostic group whose stated objective is the return of democratic rule to Altus. They operate several cells across Altus and Stratus, and until recently had sort of just been a thorn in the side of the Akanteros government, fighting a guerrilla war involving kidnapping, hit-and-run attacks, bombings, assassinations, the usual MO.
But that sort of seemed to change with the recent events in the northwest of the country, right?
Yeah, so a few months ago, the FIA got a new leader by the name of Kostas Stavro. As far as my research goes, Stavro was a mostly unknown deserter from the AAF during the Civil War, fighting for the Loyalists before officially transitioning to a civilian after the ceasefire. But in 2031, he officially announced he was joining the FIA and endorsed them as the best hope for Altus' future in a video on social media. His video kind of went viral, and he became like a popular figure within the resistance movement, before coming to full prominence in September of 2034 when the FIA took over the town of Orio Castro.
And as far as that went, how would you describe the uprising in that town? As far as I saw online, at the time it sort of looked like regular citizens taking up arms against a tyrannical government.
So, as far as I'm aware, the town's occupants for the most part were on board with the FIA when they rolled into town and took over. But when it seemed inevitable that the town would face attack by the AAF, most civilians in the town evacuated, as was urged by the government. As far as the composition of the guys who took the town over, it ranged from local volunteers to a few veterans from the Civil War and deserters from the government.
I remember the government had a hell of a time taking the town, right? Before the airstrike?
Yes. At first, the AAF sent in a column of tanks to spearpoint their attack, but several of them were knocked out by landmines, and as night fell, it seemed like the AAF were going nowhere.
This is when the government decided to call in the cluster strike on the town, right?
Correct. Around midnight, a plane of unknown nationality came in and dropped a laser-guided cluster munition. They were also likely supported by a special forces team on the ground who coordinated the strike. And as far as who it was, most people think it was probably CSAT because the government is much more closely aligned with them at the moment, although, it's really not known who specifically did it. In any event, the town was completely destroyed with heavy casualties for the guerrillas, and what few civilians were still in the town, many of them were killed or wounded.
Yeah, the strike didn't cause too much of an uproar in the mainstream media, as I recall, but it was definitely seen as an overstep by the government, with just the whole town being leveled.
Yeah, and since that airstrike, the conflict has kind of cooled down. Since then, the government continues to be accused of human rights abuses, but CSAT and NATO both continue to support them militarily and financially, although NATO is sort of being pushed out in favor of CSAT military support. As for the FIA, they're quiet at the moment, but from what I hear in circles on the internet and things, it's expected that things might flare up relatively soon on the island.
Alright, so it seems like things might flare up soon then. We can only hope that the people on Altus can somehow come to some sort of agreement in the future, because what happened to those places, what used to be beautiful vacation spots in the middle of the Med, is really just sad to see. So, Scott, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Josh.